Okay, so we finished last time on this table. I was just reminding you about what we covered before in the previous slides. Like we have here a summary of the measurements, the volumes, the capacities, and then the different volumes according to gender, and the definition. So out of all of these, vital capacity, it is, of course, the largest because it includes many of these together. And in total capacity, it can vary between 4.2 liters to 6 liters according to gender. And it's basically the total amount of exchangeable and non-exchangeable air that your lung has. So the vital capacity basically is the total lung capacity minus the residual capacity. And as I told you before, residual capacity is the amount of air that it is found within the lungs before after we exhale the maximum amount of air that we have. In terms of physics, the law of gases, we have Dalton's law of partial pressures that tells us that in a combination of gases, partial pressures will be the pressure that is exerted by that individual gas. And in our lungs and in our body, we have oxygen and carbon dioxide, which is a mixture of gases. And they have specific proportions and a specific partial pressure. And that is part of the sum of all the total. So here we have the combination of gases in the atmosphere. So in our atmosphere, we have nitrogen gas, oxygen gas, and then we have argon and other gases. So for the specific percentage of nitrogen, it's 78%, 21% for oxygen, and 1% for carbon dioxide. Nitrogen is not soluble in our body, but carbon dioxide and oxygen it is. So out of these two, oxygen and carbon dioxide, of course we have more percentage of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and that is good for us because carbon dioxide is a waste product for us, so we want to have less available. Now, if you sum the individual percentages, which in total is supposed to give you 100%, this will give you that specific pressure in the atmosphere, which is 760 millimeters of mercury at the sea level. So all you need to do to calculate the individual pressure of this gas within the atmosphere is multiply the index for percentage out of 1. So 1 will be the equivalent to 100%. And then 0.78 will represent 78. So that's the decimal. So if you multiply 0.78 times 760, that should give you 593 millimeters of mercury. That's the partial pressure of nitrogen in the atmosphere. And then for oxygen, the index will be 0.21. So if you multiply 0.21 times 760, that's supposed to give you 160 millimeters of mercury. And now for argon, if you multiply 0.0093 times 760, that gives you 7 millimeters of mercury. And then if you multiply the percentage or the index of the percentage of carbon dioxide, which is 1%, that's supposed to be 0.1 times 760 millimeters of mercury, and that's supposed to give you this specific percentage. Now, Henry's law is related to the solubility of gases. Not all the gases are soluble in a liquid. Some are more soluble than others, or some of them are insoluble. So solubility refers to the ability of the gas to dissolve in water. In the case of nitrogen, I told you before, at least in our body, is not soluble, but oxygen is soluble and carbon dioxide is soluble. So they can dissolve in our body fluids. Specifically, we will be referring to plasma. And oxygen is less soluble than carbon dioxide. Then because of this, it's much easier to transport carbon dioxide than oxygen. No matter what, this solubility can be different. Of course, well, we know that it's different in plasma. So carbon dioxide is 20 times more soluble than oxygen, but you can compensate for this oxygen not being as soluble as carbon dioxide by having a transport molecule for oxygen, which is the hemoglobin protein that we have in our red blood cells. Because our cells require a constant amount of oxygen to produce CO2. So we have to have this hemoglobin that transports oxygen. So then the carbon dioxide, it's again more soluble than oxygen. So for pulmonary gas exchange, it is basically the interchange of gases, oxygen and CO2, between the alveoli and the blood, in the case of the lungs, and between the tissues and the blood in the case of our tissues. So thanks to this exchange, we don't keep forever the CO2, which is a waste, and we are not only completely oxygenated, preventing the charge of CO2 into this hemoglobin so that we can get rid of the CO2. Now, pulmonary gas exchange is specifically called external respiration. So in external respiration, we get rid of carbon dioxide while we obtain oxygen. And we have the pulmonary veins that, if you recall, they carry the oxygen-rich blood into the left atrium after your carbon dioxide is eliminated from our blood. So here is the events that happens in this pulmonary gas exchange. So our right side of the heart receives CO2-rich blood from the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus, the right atrium. The right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the systemic circuit, pumps it into the into the right ventricle. The right ventricle is going to deliver this deoxygenated blood into the lungs via the pulmonary arteries. The pulmonary arteries will form these capillaries that are going to be surrounding the alveoli, and then just as any other capillaries, you have a venous end that is CO2 rich and an arterial end that it is oxygen rich. But in this case, this arterial end, because it's coming from an artery, which is the pulmonary artery, you will have CO2 rich blood. This is the exception. Remember, these are the arteries that carry CO2-rich blood. So this is the arterial end, and this is the venous end. So if you magnify this region where you have the alveoli and the capillary making this respiratory membrane, you can see what happens at this lower level. So you will have these erythrocytes that has a lot of CO2, bringing CO2 from the arterial end, from these capillaries, into the alveolus. So this CO2 doesn't have to have any specific transport because this is a gas that it is highly soluble. So it can cross through these cells really easily. And then you will eliminate CO2, so you will exhale CO2. So from the alveoli, the CO2 will go being carried into these bronchioles, first the respiratory, then the terminals, then the tertiary, secondary, primary, and then to the trachea, and then into your nasal cavity, and then you exhale the CO2. So it's the opposite of inhalation. And then, hopefully, the environment where someone is located is reaching oxygen. So your alveoli will be having a lot of partial pressure of oxygen. And then because you have more concentration here than less oxygen in here, oxygen will diffuse from more to less, from the alveolus into the capillaries. And then part of this oxygen will go and bind into hemoglobin, and then part of it will go into plasma. So this is just to show you the different concentration of oxygen and CO2 within this area. So in the alveolus, the concentration is going to be 104 millimeters of mercury. And in the capillaries, it's going to be 40 millimeters of mercury. So how much difference do we have there? What is the gradient? 104 here and 40 here. What is the difference? Subtract this from this. So what is the difference? Subtracting this from this. 64. So because you have 64 millimeters of difference between the partial pressure of oxygen, then from 104, you will diffuse oxygen into 40. And then in here, you have 45 partial pressure of CO2 is written PCO2. In this case, for oxygen will be PO2. So you have 45 here and 40 here. So what is the difference? 5. So then you don't have to have a large difference for CO2 to exit. So CO2 will diffuse from more to less, while oxygen also from more to less. So that's what happens in the pulmonary circuit. That's external respiration. Now for internal respiration in our tissues, this is what happens, guys. So if you magnify one of these areas in our tissues, like let's say from the abdominal area, you see some capillaries that are surrounding your tissue cells in your abdomen. Well, you can see here this membrane, which is not a respiratory membrane as this, but you can see here the connection between these blood vessels, the capillaries that surround the cells. So your cells, as they are performing the metabolism, they generate CO2, And oxygen is brought by these capillaries. So the arterial end, and then here you have the venous end. So then your arterial end of your capillaries has a partial pressure of CO2 of 100 millimeters of mercury. And your cells, after they perform their metabolism, they have a partial pressure of oxygen of 40 millimeters of mercury. So while your capillaries have 100 PO2, your cells have 40. So what is the difference there? So you have 100 here and you have 40 here. 60. So the oxygen will move from 100 to 60, to 40, sorry. And now, your cells, they undergo glycolysis, Krebs cycle, they generate CO2, so they will have a partial pressure of CO2 of 40 millimeters of mercury, PCO2 of 45 millimeters of mercury here, and 40 in here. What is the difference? 5. So we'll move from 45 to 40, from the cells into your capillaries. So that's the gas exchange. This is internal respiration. Any questions? So what factors affects the efficiency of pulmonary gas exchange? Well, one factor is the surface area that you have available. We have about 1,000 square feet of surface area for gas exchange. And then, at a given time, we have 75 to 100 milliliters of blood in the pulmonary capillaries that they have to have contact with this, the erythrocytes from this blood, they have to be in contact with the respiratory surface. So if you reduce this surface, like for instance, if someone has emphysema, instead of having 1,000 square feet of surface area available, maybe the person has 200, then is losing a lot of ability to oxygenate this amount of blood. So that will lead to poor oxygenation, low oxygen levels in your blood. This is called hypoxemia. Your cells won't be happy. And then you can have accumulation of CO2, which is known as hypercapnia. Every time that someone accumulates CO2, the person will have high levels of hydrogen ions. This is called acidemia. And then the enzymes of our body, they won't be happy. Another factor that affects the ability to have gas exchange in the lungs is the thickness of the respiratory membrane. The respiratory membrane, it is as thin as 0.2 micrometers. But some people may have increased thickness, like greater than 0.6 micrometers, and then CO2 and oxygen don't diffuse as much. Let me compare it to something. You purchase a very expensive perfume and you're trying to impress someone. You don't put that perfume in your skin and then wear layers and layers and layers of clothing because you won't have diffusion. So that's what happened with our respiratory membrane. Sometimes it's getting thicker and thicker. When someone smokes a lot or vapes, that membrane becomes thicker, so you have less oxygenation. See the color of the skin of someone who smokes a lot. It doesn't look as the normal color. It looks bluish, cyanotic, because they keep the CO2 and they cannot bring in oxygen. Another factor that affects the pulmonary gas exchange, it is ventilation perfusion matching or mismatch. Ventilation is inhaling, exhaling, bringing in air into the lungs, bringing out the air out of the lungs. And perfusion is bringing blood supply to a tissue. If someone has an embolus that obstructs one of these branches of the pulmonary artery, then the person won't have perfusion in a specific area of the lungs. The oxygen will come into the alveoli, but it won't be picked up. It's like if you order food in a fast food restaurant and then you never picked it up. You didn't perfuse. The food is there for you, but well, I don't know what happened to you. I will pick it up, of course. Why will I order if I don't pick it up? But let's say that maybe you ran into an accident. Then the food will be there. That's the lack of perfusion. And then sometimes you can have lack of ventilation, but you have normal perfusion. Let's say that your blood vessels are working well, but then you don't have ventilation, so the oxygen doesn't arrive. Why would that happen? Why will make oxygen not being flowing through your bronchioles and going into your alveolus? You're eating while you're talking. Piece of food going to your airways. And it's a big piece of food. Will you have normal ventilation or you will have lack of ventilation? Lack of ventilation. An aspirated foreign object can occlude your bronchioles. So that's lack of ventilation. That's, you can have the blood going through your bronchioles and then through your alveoli, but if no air comes in, what about a tumor in the lungs that compresses your bronchioles? Can that tumor grow so big that it compresses totally your bronchioles and then you don't have air coming in? Yes. So that's the lack of this ventilation. So it's a mismatch. So here is the normal situation. So you have an alveoli here and your capillaries surrounding. So you have normal circulation, normal perfusion, your alveolus is healthy. In this case, for this mismatching, which is here in the bottom, you have low PO2 in your alveolus because you have an external obstruction, a tumor compressing your bronchioles. But these capillaries are normal. Now, in this mismatch, you will have dilation of these pulmonary arterioles, and that will help to increase the oxygenation because you will have more, it's like a compensatory mechanism. You have more oxygen coming into your alveolus, and then you are preparing by dilating. While when you have this constriction or this obstruction, your arterioles, they become smaller. Now, in this case, you have this constriction of your bronchioles. Let's say someone is having an asthmatic attack. So you will have entrapment of this CO2 here, because you cannot diffuse this CO2 into this alveoli. And then if you take a bronchodilator, then this CO2 can be diffused out, and then you have oxygenation. So in the BQ mismatch, B stands for ventilation, Q for perfusion. You will have different causes, including pneumonia, asthma, pulmonary edema. In pulmonary edema, your alveoli will have fluid instead of oxygen. And then you will have something that is called the right to left shunt, in which your blood is shunted to the left side without receiving adequate oxygenation. So no matter what is happening, what is the cause of the BQ mismatch, you have poor oxygenation and your cells will suffer. Now for tissue gas exchange, we have, of course, the movement of oxygen into your cells, because you have in the arterial end of your capillaries more pressure than the tissues themselves, and then oxygen will diffuse. And then CO2 will be available to go into your blood in the venous end, and then you will drive this CO2 into the veins so that the veins can return this CO2 into your right atrium, and then goes into the right ventricle, and then you will deliver that into the lungs to have oxygenation. So in a way, internal respiration is linked to the circulatory system and also to the gas exchange in the lungs. If you have poor diffusion in this area, you have poor oxygenation in general. So CO2, it's diffusing again from the cells after they perform their metabolism, because you have 45 millimeters of mercury of partial pressure of CO2 and 40 in your arterial end, in your capillaries. So that's internal and external respiration. Now for transport of oxygen. Oxygen can be transported when bound to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is heme, can carry oxygen molecules. And these oxygen molecules, when it binds to hemoglobin, will convert this hemoglobin into what we call oxyhemoglobin. Now, in the center of this heme group, you have iron. And this iron is the one that binds these oxygen molecules. And oxygen molecules can be carried up to 4 in each of these hemoglobin. And when you bind the first oxygen molecule, the rest bind easily every time. So this is like making these around 280 million of hemoglobin proteins that we have in each erythrocyte to carry about 1 billion of oxygen molecules. One single erythrocyte can bind over 1 billion of oxygen molecules. And then when you deoxygenate your hemoglobin, you call this hemoglobin deoxyhemoglobin. And now this one can be able to pick up CO2. Now, this is what happens in the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. So when you have oxygen, which is represented by these little spheres in your alveoli, when oxygen diffuses into this capillary that surrounds the alveoli, so this is the respiratory membrane, this hemoglobin, initially it is carrying CO2 and also hydrogen molecules. So these erythrocytes in this end, which is the arterial end, has the CO2 in it. So this will be carbaminohemoglobin. And then this CO2 will diffuse out, first into plasma and then into the alveoli. So after you discharge this CO2 from this hemoglobin now can accept oxygen molecules and become HbO2, which is oxyhemoglobin. You can visualize hemoglobin like if it was a taxi that basically, or an Uber that carries always passengers. So in this case, it's CO2 first, you release CO2, and now you can pick up oxygen so that you can have oxygenated hemoglobin. And now this oxygenated rich blood can go into the left side of the heart so that the left side of the heart can pump this oxygenated blood into the cells, into the tissues, into the capillaries, so that this oxygen will be picked up by these cells. Now, as our cells make the CO2, this interstitial fluid that surrounds the cells become acidic. This acidity makes the the hemoglobin molecules to open up. So hemoglobin, it's a quaternary structure. So it has 4 globin chains, and then in the center of these chains, they have the heme. And then this heme has, in this case for this arterial end, has oxygenated hemoglobin, so it has oxygen. When it reaches this area where you have acidity, this acidity opens up these globin molecules so that you can release the oxygen. That is facilitating the discharge or release of this oxygen. And now, since you have this oxygen available for these cells to be picked up, now you have CO2 that is going to go and bind to this CO2, converting the previously oxyhemoglobin into carbaminohemoglobin. So what does the Uber or the taxis need to carry more passengers? The passengers that it's already bringing to this specific area can be the airport, needs to get down or just get off from this taxi or this Uber so that the next set of passengers can come in. So it's a delivery system, hemoglobin. It's a protein that delivers oxygen to unload it, and then it can load CO2. So that's the transport of oxygen. And then if you graph this in a graph that shows the percentage of oxygen saturating this hemoglobin, so from 0% up to 100%, and this part of the graph showing you the partial pressure of oxygen from 0 millimeters of mercury to 100 millimeters of mercury, you can see this sigmoid curve in which as you increase the partial pressure of oxygen, the PO2, you can have more loading of molecules of hemoglobin with oxygen. So this is a cooperative effect. The first one, oxygen that binds into hemoglobin, into these 4 spaces that hemoglobin have, makes for the next one to bind much easier. And you never reach 100% of oxygenation of the hemoglobin. Close to it is 98% at a partial pressure of 100 millimeters of mercury, but that's enough. Now, hemoglobin binds oxygen less strongly than CO2. But still, that acidity that our cells accumulate in surroundings makes these molecules to open up and to release the oxygen and to bind CO2 and keep the cycle going so that we don't have permanent binding of oxygen and CO2. If the taxi doesn't let go the passengers, that is a sequester. So hemoglobin has to unload CO2, pick up oxygen, unload CO2, pick up oxygen. Keep on going like that. It doesn't sequester oxygen, doesn't sequester CO2. So in the case of oxygen, hemoglobin changes very little when the partial pressure drops to 80. Never gets above 80 to 85 in some individuals. And then for the percentage of saturation rapidly changes when it drops lower to 40. And this is because the hemoglobin to unload the oxygen molecules is fast enough to help for the cells to receive the oxygen. So we have, for instance, cases in which someone starts doing exercise, or when someone, it generates a lot of CO2, or when someone is in an atmosphere where you have high levels of CO2. In this case, the partial pressure of oxygen can drop rapidly. But then that rapid change leads to unloading of the oxygen also really rapidly, 0.75 seconds of a second, helping for this unloading to happen. And then these are factors that can modify the binding of oxygen into CO2, including temperature, concentration of hydrogen ions, and the presence of certain molecules, products of glycolysis, that tells you if your body has an active metabolism or not. When you have an active metabolism, you release more oxygen into your cells so that you can generate more energy, more ATP. In terms of temperature, when your temperature increases, more oxygen is released. Why? Because that opens up more the proteins, the hemoglobin including. So increasing temperature increases the unfolding of hemoglobin so that you can release more oxygen. And the opposite is true. If you have lower temperature, you release less likely the oxygen. In terms of concentration of hydrogen ions, when you have more hydrogen ions, because you are more active, you have more acidity, that also as well open up more the hemoglobin protein, so you release more easily the oxygen. And then that is correlated to CO2. Every time that you have more CO2, you have more hydrogen ions. So that means that you need to release more rapidly CO2. And then how do you transport CO2? Well, remember in the mitochondria, that's where we generate ATP, that's where we generate CO2, and then CO2 moves from the mitochondria into the cytoplasm of your cells, into your interstitial space, which is outside of your cells, and then into your capillaries, and then your capillaries, which are carrying, of course, your red blood cells, will make CO2 to combine first with water with the aid of an enzyme that is called carbonic anhydrase. This enzyme, you will see it over and over again in many systems. So when you hydrate, because you're adding water, that's hydration, when you hydrate CO2, you will make a molecule that is called carbonic acid. This is H2CO3. And then this H2CO3, by the same enzyme, will be dissociated into hydrogen ions and into bicarbonate. This bicarbonate is going to be the form of transport of CO2 in plasma. This bicarbonate will be exchanged for chloride. And then you will have transport of CO2. Now this hydrogen is going to combine with hemoglobin, and then you have this to be ready to pick up oxygen. Now, this acidified hemoglobin molecule, because you have a hydrogen ion, can release this hydrogen ion, and this hydrogen ion can combine with bicarbonate, the bicarbonate that comes from plasma, in exchange for chloride. So your erythrocyte can release chloride and then pick up this bicarbonate, which is HCO3 minus. And then when you combine these two by the same enzyme, carbonic anhydrase, you form H2CO3, which is carbonic acid. And this same enzyme will break down this carbonic acid into water and CO2. So this CO2 now can diffuse and go into the alveoli. So it's the reversal of what we saw before for oxygenation in the tissues. And then the release of the CO2 by the cells, and then you transport the CO2 through plasma as bicarbonate. So see how this bicarbonate gets converted into CO2 and water, but before into carbonic acid. And then you can diffuse out this CO2 into your alveoli. And then what else goes out? Water. When you're exhaling, don't think that you're exhaling only CO2. You are exhaling water as well. Put the palm of your hand in front of your mouth. Or if you don't want to exhale the air through your mouth, feel your nose or do this. How does it feel? What are you exhaling? Vapor, you're exhaling water. So that goes out of our body, water and CO2. So our respiratory system with this exchange of CO2, oxygen, hydrogen ions, helps to control the pH in our body. So our pH is the concentration of hydrogen ions. And then when it comes to pure water pH is 7. But the plasma pH, it is a little bit basic. It's between 7.35 to 7.45. It's between 7.35 to 7.45. So it's tightly regulated. And part of the systems in our body that regulates the concentration of hydrogen ions, it is the respiratory system. By helping us to get rid of CO2, we get rid of these hydrogen ions. So if someone has a pH above 7.45, this is known as alkalosis. If someone has a pH less than 7.35, this is known as acidosis. This symbol, guys, means greater than. And then this symbol means less than. So, when you perform physical activity, you generate more CO2, you will have greater concentration of hydrogen ions. Your pH in the plasma will be less than 7.35. This is acidosis. This means that you have increased, this equals increased concentration of hydrogen ions. In chemistry, brackets means concentration. So your pH decreases, your concentration of hydrogen ion increases. And then for alkalosis, your concentration of hydrogen ions decreases. So that means that your CO2 the concentration of CO2, it is decreased. And then in acidosis, the concentration of CO2 increases. So these two are correlated. When you have more CO2 in your body, you have more hydrogen. When you have less hydrogen ions, that means that you have less CO2 in general. And then when someone is in acidosis, the typical response is that the person starts breathing more because you're trying to get rid of CO2. When someone is in alkalosis, the person tends to breathe less. And they are respiratory causes and metabolic causes for acidosis and alkalosis. Respiratory alkalosis, respiratory acidosis refers to problems in the lungs. The rest will be outside of the lungs, the metabolic. So, in this image, what you can see is that when you have the pH scale, by the way, is between 1 through 14. Neutral pH for the water is 7, pure water. So when you move above 7, your hydrogen ions, which represents these little dots, become less. So basic solutions, basic items have less hydrogen ions, while acidic has more hydrogen ions. pH of the stomach, it's around 3. So that's where the acid in the stomach. So that's where we have a lot of hydrogen ions. So then this is the pattern of ventilation. During normal ventilation, your alveoli get filled with CO2 as we exchange for oxygen, and then you get rid of the CO2. This will lead for your blood to get rid of any hydrogen ions coming from this HCO3. So your pH will remain stable as long as you're breathing properly, between 7.35 to 7.45. Let's say that someone receives bad news, and the person is an emotional person. You cannot handle well stress. The person can start breathing more. This is called hyperventilation. They start like panicking. That is going to get rid of more CO2. And then the hydrogen ions concentration goes down, and that leads to the person fainting. So I don't know if you have seen it in sitcoms or in movies, but when someone is hyperventilating, what does the people around them tell them? Oh, well, sit down, calm down. They start to calm down the person. And what else did they do besides trying to calm down the person so that it stops hyperventilating? They put a brown bag around their mouth and their nose. Why do you think is that? And they say, breathe in, breathe out. What they're trying to do with putting a brown bag so that the person breathe in and out inside the bag. They're trying to bring back the breath of the person into the body, because what does the breath of that person will have? CO2. The person is getting rid of CO2. That is going to increase the pH, so it will go above 7.45, and you're trying to bring it to normal by breathing in its own CO2. So in hyperventilation, you have more CO2. That increases the pH above 7.45 because more CO2 is exhaled. The blood PCO2 decreases. That leads for the carbonic acid to release fewer hydrogen ions. And then your hydrogen ion concentration decreases and your blood pH increases above 7.45. The opposite in hypoventilation. In hypoventilation, you keep the CO2, you have less CO2 going out of your body. See how in here you get rid of more when you're breathing more? And then if you start breathing less, you accumulate CO2 here. So less CO2 is expired, so your pH goes below 7.35, so you are acidotic. So your blood PCO2 increases. Instead of having 40 millimeters of mercury, you have greater than 40. Your carbonic acid releases more hydrogen ions, so your hydrogen ion in blood increases more, and your blood pH decreases. So the big picture means that you have to have normal levels of CO2 and oxygen in your body by exchanging it properly here within your lungs without any obstructions, either in the airways or in your capillaries because you have an embolus. And then you have normal diffusion of CO2 from your capillaries in your lungs into the alveoli, and normal oxygenation because you have a proper environment where you have normal levels of oxygen in your alveoli, and then from your alveoli you have diffusion of oxygen into your capillaries. And then that is going to make your blood to be properly distributed with the proper levels of oxygenation by your arteries and veins that were pumped out, or your arteries that were pumped out with the normal levels of oxygen in your blood. Your PO2 is normal, like 100 millimeters of mercury. And then that can arrive into your cells. Your cells properly sends this CO2 into your capillaries, and then the cycle continues. Now, at the brain level, we control rate of respiration, pattern of respiration. We have two major control centers in our body. They are located here in this area. So if you magnify this area, if you remember, we have the pons here, medulla oblongata here, and spinal cord here. So it is here in the pons and in the medulla oblongata where we have neurons that are specifically form the respiratory centers. So we have the ventral respiratory group and the respiratory pattern group generator. We have connections for the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves here that brings information from the heart and also from the lungs in an afferent or arriving mode, like sending action potentials through these nerves so that these nuclei from the glossopharyngeal vagus nerves communicate with these centers, the BRG, the RPG, and also this grouping here that is called the dorsal respiratory group. So all of them, they form a reflex. So you have arrival of signals through this glossopharyngeal and vagus nerve, and then you have interneurons that connects these nuclei from these nerves into the DRG first, and then the DRG will send efferent signals into your phrenic nerve, into your diaphragm using the phrenic nerve, or through these intercostal nerves that controls your external and internal intercostals. So if someone has damage to this because might have a whiplash accident, bilaterally you destroy these respiratory centers, the person will have something that's called apnea. Apnea is the absence of breathing, and the person will die. Now, the phrenic nerve, it is formed by C3, C4, and C5 spinal nerve. C3, C4, C5 keep the diaphragm alive. If someone also has bilateral damage because he has a whiplash accident, severes the C3, C4, C5 roots, the person will stop breathing. They will die. That's apnea. So let's look at some integration of these concepts. So what activates these centers? Well, an example would be when you have increased number of partial pressure of CO2 or increased levels of hydrogen ions. So that's the stimulus. When this goes high, you will send a signal through this vagus nerve and the glossopharyngeal, and also by receiving this signal in the central chemoreceptors that we have in this area that detects the levels of CO2 and the hydrogen ions. So you will activate your respiratory pattern generator, which is going to trigger hyperventilation with these RPG neurons. So you will send an efferent signal so that you will activate your muscles of breathing so that you will breathe more, and then you lose CO2, and at the same time you lose hydrogen. Now your kidneys also respond. Your kidneys will eliminate more hydrogen ions. So it's not only your respiratory center, your respiratory system. So then you will return to normal. So that's the response with the central chemoreceptors. Now what will happen in the opposite? Like let's say that you have less CO2 and less hydrogen ions. Your central chemoreceptors detect this, and then they will send a signal with this RPG, and then you will breathe less, so you have hyperventilation, you release less CO2. That will help to bring more, keep more hydrogen ions so that you can return to your 7.35 to 7.45 pH. And then you have control mechanisms of ventilation that not only include your central chemoreceptors, but also the peripheral that also takes CO2 levels and hydrogen ions. But these ones are located in your carotid arteries and also in your aortic arch. These are called aortic bodies and carotid bodies. So we have central chemoreceptors, peripheral receptors, but also we have voluntary control. Our cerebral cortex can control our breathing pattern. As I told you, some people, they cannot handle so much stress. So with this cerebral cortex, they can send signals to these respiratory centers so that you can breathe more. And then we have pulmonary stress receptors that sends a negative signal to prevent hyperventilation. So your lungs know how long and how much they have distended, and that prevents hyperventilating. So that's all for this chapter. Do you have any questions? Okay.